The day I received the certified letter from Rosewood Estates Homeowners Association was the beginning of my personal war. I glared at the official letterhead, my coffee going cold beside me as I read the words that would upend my peaceful suburban existence in Portland, Oregon. "Dear Mr. Brandon Oswald," it began, with all the false pleasantness of a rattlesnake's warning. "It has come to our attention that the fence on your property exceeds the maximum height restriction of 6 feet as outlined in the Rosewood Estates HOA covenant, Section 7.3. You are hereby required to reduce the height to the appropriate measurement within 30 days or face a fine of $100 per day until compliance is achieved." I crumpled the paper in my fist, looking out my kitchen window at the cedar fence I'd installed just 3 months ago. The fence that had cost me nearly $8,000 to have professionally installed. The fence that, according to the contractors who built it, was exactly 6 feet tall, just as I'd specified. I grabbed my tape measure from the garage and marched out to the backyard, determined to prove this was some kind of mistake. Running the metal tape from the ground to the top of one of the cedar planks, I confirmed what I already knew, 6 feet exactly. I measured in 3 different spots with the same result each time. "What the hell?" I muttered, stuffing the tape measure into my back pocket. I needed to get this cleared up immediately. The HOA in Rosewood Estates had a reputation for being particularly zealous in their rule enforcement, but this was absurd. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the letterhead. After several rings, a receptionist answered. "Rosewood Estates HOA, how may I help you?" "This is Brandon Oswald at 1427 Pinecrest Drive. I just received a notice about my fence height, and there's been a mistake. My fence is exactly 6 feet tall." "One moment, Mr. Oswald. I'll connect you with Mrs. Levine. She handles covenant enforcement." After a brief hold with terrible muzak, a sharp voice came through the phone. "This is Patricia Levine. How can I help you?" "Mrs. Levine, I'm calling about a notice I received claiming my fence is too tall. I've just measured it and it's exactly 6 feet, which is within your guidelines." "Mr. Oswald," she said with the condescending tone I would come to know all too well, "our compliance officer measured your fence yesterday, and it was found to be 6 feet 4 inches in height. That's a clear violation." "That's impossible." I'm standing here with the tape measure in my hand. "Perhaps you're not measuring from the correct point, Mr. Oswald. The measurement begins at ground level, not the top of any decorative base." I took a deep breath. "I understand how to measure a fence, Mrs. Levine." "I'm telling you it's 6 feet. "Well, our measurements differ, and as per our covenant, the HOA's assessment is what matters. You have 30 days to comply. This is ridiculous. Who measured it? I want to be present for a remeasurement." "That won't be necessary, Mr. Oswald. Our process is quite thorough." "I insist," I said firmly. "I have the right to be present when you're assessing my property." A long sigh came through the phone. "Very well. I can have our compliance officer meet you tomorrow at 4 p.m. "I'll be there," I said and hung up fuming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, thinking about the fence and wondering if there was any chance I could have missed something. I'd been living in Rosewood Estates for just under a year. My job as a software engineer had brought me to Portland from Seattle, and I'd fallen in love with this neighborhood of modern homes nestled among old-growth firs. The HOA had seemed like a small price to pay for the well-maintained common areas and the sense of order. Now, I wasn't so sure. The next day, I left work early to make the 4 p.m. appointment. When I pulled into my driveway, a white SUV with Rosewood Estates HOA emblazoned on the side was already parked in front of my house. A woman in her mid-50s with a severely short haircut and clipboard was standing on the sidewalk, peering at my fence with an expression of disapproval. I climbed out of my car and approached her. "You must be the compliance officer. I'm Brandon Oswald." "Deborah Carson," she replied without a smile, extending a hand with nails painted a sharp red. "I understand you're disputing our measurement." "I am. The fence is exactly 6 feet tall. I'd like to see how you're measuring it." "Of course," she said, reaching into a bag and pulling out a laser measuring device. "We use state-of-the-art equipment for accuracy." We walked to the backyard, and I watched as she placed the device on the ground near the fence and pressed a button. A red beam shot up to the top of the fence. 6 feet, 4 inches, she announced, showing me the digital readout. I frowned. "That can't be right. Let me get my tape measure." I retrieved my tape measure from the garage and pulled it from the ground to the top of the fence. "See, 6 feet exactly." Deborah peered at my measurement with skepticism. "Your tape measure may be inaccurate. Our laser device is calibrated regularly." "Let's try another spot," I suggested, moving a few feet down the fence line. We repeated the process 3 more times, with her device consistently showing 6 feet 4 inches and my tape measure showing 6 feet. "This doesn't make sense," I said, frustrated. "Let me see your device." Reluctantly, she handed it over. I placed it on the ground as she had done and pressed the button. The readout showed 6 feet 4 inches. I moved it slightly and tried again. 6 feet. "Wait a minute," I said, examining the spot where she'd placed the device. There was a subtle dip in the ground there, making the starting point lower. "You're not measuring from the actual ground level. You're starting from this depression." "Mr. Oswald, I assure you I'm following proper procedure." I stood up, increasingly annoyed. "This isn't right. The fence is 6 feet tall from the actual grade level of the yard, as specified in your own guidelines." "I'm afraid my measurement stands," Deborah said firmly, taking back her device. "You have 27 days left to bring your fence into compliance." "This is absurd," I said. "I'm going to appeal this." "That's your right," she replied coolly. "You can file a formal appeal with the HOA board. The form is on our website." As she walked away, I noticed her pausing to make notes about my neighbor's landscaping. It seemed Deborah Carson found issues wherever she looked. That evening, I sat at my computer, researching the Rosewood Estates HOA covenant in detail. I discovered that appeals had to be filed within 14 days of a notice, and hearings were held monthly. I filled out the form, attaching photos of my measurements and a copy of the installation contract specifying a 6-foot fence. While I was at it, I decided to dig deeper into the history of enforcement actions in our neighborhood. I joined the community Facebook group and posted a simple question. "Has anyone had issues with fence height measurements from the HOA?" The responses came in faster than I expected. "They tried to fine me for a fence that was too short," wrote one neighbor. "Patricia Levine measured my gate 4 times until she found a spot where it was half an inch too tall," added another. "Watch out, they use these fines as a revenue stream," warned a third. I was beginning to understand that my situation wasn't unique. The Rosewood Estates HOA, led by Patricia Levine, had a reputation for finding violations where none existed. It seemed their goal was less about maintaining community standards and more about collecting fines. The next morning, I received an email confirming my appeal would be heard at the next board meeting, scheduled for 2 weeks away. In the meantime, I decided to take matters into my own hands. If the HOA wanted to play games with measurements, I needed to establish exactly where my property began and ended. I called a professional land surveyor recommended by a colleague. Frank Wilson of Precision Boundary Surveys had been in business for 30 years and had experience dealing with HOA disputes. "HOA troubles, huh?" Frank said when I explained my situation over the phone. "I see this all the time. They claim a fence or structure violates their rules, but often the real issue is they don't know where the property lines actually are." "Can you help me?" I asked. "Absolutely. I'll need to access the original plat maps and your property deed, and then we'll do a physical survey. It'll cost about $1,200. It wasn't a small amount, but compared to the potential fines and the cost of altering my fence, it seemed like a necessary investment. When can you start? I can be out there tomorrow morning if that works for you." I took the day off work to meet Frank, who arrived in a truck loaded with tripods, transit levels, and other surveying equipment. He was a grizzled man in his 60s with a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of decades of fieldwork. "Let's start by looking at your deed and the plat map," he said as we sat at my kitchen table. I provided the documents and he spread them out, studying them carefully. "Interesting," he muttered. "According to this, your property extends 3 feet beyond where your fence is currently placed." "Did you know that?" I was stunned. "No, I assumed the fence was on the property line." "A common assumption, but often incorrect. Let's go take some measurements." For the next several hours, Frank methodically placed stakes, took readings, and made notes. He used a sophisticated GPS system to establish precise coordinates and compared them to the legal description of my property. By mid-afternoon, he had placed markers showing my actual property boundaries. To my surprise, not only was my fence well within my property, but it was actually set back from the true boundary by about 3 feet all along the back and side yard. "So my fence isn't just the right height," I said. "It's not even at the edge of my property." "That's correct," Frank confirmed. "Whoever built it was being conservative. You actually own more land than you're utilizing." This revelation changed everything. If the fence was entirely on my property, set back from the boundary, the HOA's complaint about height seemed even more ridiculous. What do I do with this information? I asked Frank. "I'll prepare an official survey report with my stamp as a licensed surveyor. This is a legal document that can be used in court if necessary. I'll also mark the actual boundaries with permanent stakes." "Thank you," I said, feeling a new confidence. "This could make a big difference." "One more thing," Frank added as he packed up his equipment. "In my experience, HOAs often back down when presented with professional survey results. They don't want to risk legal action, especially when they're clearly in the wrong." After Frank left, I took photos of all the survey markers and sent a quick email to Patricia Levine, informing her that I had commissioned a professional survey and would be presenting the results at my appeal hearing. I didn't share the details yet. I wanted to see the look on her face when she realized her mistake. The next 2 weeks were busy. I continued my research into the HOA's enforcement patterns and discovered that since Patricia had become president 3 years ago, fine revenue had increased by 300%. I also learned that Deborah Carson, the compliance officer, was Patricia's cousin, hired without a formal selection process. I connected with several neighbors who had their own HOA horror stories. Felicity Walker, who lived 2 doors down, told me about being fined for having the wrong shade of white on her trim. "It was antique white instead of classic white," she explained when I stopped by her house one evening. "I had to repaint my entire house. Cost me $4,000. "That's outrageous," I said. "Did you fight it?" Felicity, a graphic designer in her 30s with vibrant blue-streaked hair that somehow hadn't triggered an HOA violation, shook her head. "I tried, but Patricia has the board wrapped around her finger. It was easier to just comply." "Well, I'm not complying," I told her. and I think I have evidence that they're overreaching. Be careful, she warned. Patricia doesn't like being challenged. Last guy who really stood up to her ended up with so many violations he eventually sold his house and moved. Her warning only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about my fence anymore, it was about standing up to a system that had gone too far. The day of the appeal hearing arrived. It was held in the community clubhouse, a modern building with large windows overlooking the neighborhood pool. I arrived early, carrying a folder with my evidence, the survey report, photographs, and a timeline of events. The board members were already seated at a long table at the front of the room. Patricia Levine sat in the center, flanked by 4 other members. I recognized most of them from neighborhood events, though we'd never spoken at length. Deborah Carson sat at a smaller table to the side, her clipboard in front of her. A few other residents filtered in, taking seats in the back. I noticed Felicity among them, giving me an encouraging thumbs up. The board will now hear the appeal of Brandon Oswald regarding violation notice 2347, fence height restriction, Patricia announced at exactly 7 p.m. Mr. Oswald, you have 5 minutes to present your case. I stood and approached the podium set up facing the board. Thank you for hearing my appeal. I'm contesting the violation notice regarding my fence height for 2 reasons. First, the fence is indeed 6 feet tall when properly measured from the actual grade level, as your own covenant specifies. I displayed the photos I had taken with my tape measure. As you can see, the measurement of 6 feet is consistent along the fence line when measured correctly. Patricia's expression remained impassive, but I noticed a slight tightening around her mouth. However, there's a more fundamental issue at play here, I continued. I recently had my property professionally surveyed, and I've discovered that my fence is actually set back from my property line by approximately 3 feet. I placed Frank Wilson's official survey on the document camera, and it was projected onto a screen for all to see. This survey, conducted by Precision Boundary Surveys, a licensed firm, clearly shows that my entire fence is well within my property boundaries. I could hear murmurs from the residents behind me. According to legal precedent and Oregon state law, homeowners have greater latitude regarding structures that are not on property lines or in easements. Since my fence is entirely on my property and not on a boundary, the HOA's authority to regulate its height is significantly diminished. Patricia leaned forward. Mr. Oswald, our covenant clearly states that all fences, regardless of location, must adhere to the 6-foot height restriction. I understand that, Mrs. Levine, but the fence is 6 feet tall, I replied calmly. Furthermore, I've been advised by legal counsel that HOA restrictions on structures wholly within property boundaries, not visible from the street, and not affecting community resources are subject to a higher standard of scrutiny under Oregon law. This wasn't entirely true. I hadn't consulted a lawyer yet, but I had done enough research to know it was a valid point. Additionally, I continued, I've documented that the measurement technique used by your compliance officer was flawed. She placed her measuring device in a depression in the ground, artificially increasing the height reading. I showed a close-up photo of Deborah's device placement. The covenant specifies measurement from grade level, not from arbitrary low points. Patricia's face had reddened slightly. Thank you, Mr. Oswald. The board will now deliberate on your appeal. Before you do, I said quickly, I'd like to point out one more thing. I've spoken with several neighbors who have experienced similar measurement discrepancies. I believe there may be a pattern of inconsistent enforcement that could constitute a breach of the HOA's fiduciary duty to fairly represent all homeowners. This caused more than murmurs. There were actual gasps from the audience. Challenging an HOA on procedural grounds was one thing. Suggesting impropriety was quite another. "That's quite enough, Mr. Oswald," Patricia said sharply. "Please take your seat while we discuss this matter privately." The board members left the room, and for 15 uncomfortable minutes, the residents and I waited in silence. Felicity gave me an impressed nod, while others looked at me with a mixture of awe and concern. When the board returned, Patricia's expression was rigid. "The board has decided to dismiss the violation notice regarding Mr. Oswald's fence height. However, we want to make it clear that this decision is based solely on the property line issue and does not reflect any acknowledgement of improper enforcement procedures." I had won, but Patricia was trying to save face. I decided to accept the victory graciously. "Thank you for your reconsideration," I said simply, gathering my documents. As I turned to leave, Patricia added, "Mr. Oswald, the board would like to remind you that all other covenant provisions still apply to your property. We will be monitoring compliance closely." It was a thinly veiled threat, but I just nodded and walked out, several neighbors following me into the parking lot. "That was amazing," Felicity said, catching up to me. "No one ever wins against Patricia." "The survey was the key," I explained. "Hard to argue with professional measurements." "Do you think she'll retaliate?" asked an older man I recognized from down the street. "Probably," I admitted. "But now I know how to fight back." The next few weeks were surprisingly quiet. I half expected to receive notices for other alleged violations, but nothing came. Perhaps Patricia was regrouping, or maybe she decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, I remained vigilant. Then, about a month after the hearing, I came home to find Deborah Carson in my front yard, taking photographs of my landscaping. I parked in the driveway and approached her. "Miss Carson, can I help you with something?" She startled slightly, then composed herself. "Just routine compliance checks, Mr. Oswald. Your front garden beds appear to contain non-approved plant species." I looked at my garden beds, filled with native Oregon plants specifically chosen for their drought tolerance and suitability to the local ecosystem. "These are all on the approved list. I checked before planting them." "The approved list was updated last month," she said with a slight smile. "These ferns are no longer permitted." "I wasn't notified of any changes to the approved plant list," I said, keeping my voice level despite my rising frustration. "The updates were posted on the community website," she replied. "It's your responsibility to stay informed of changes." This was a new tactic, changing the rules without clear notification, and then enforcing the new standards immediately. I decided not to argue in the moment. "I'll look into it," I said simply. "Please provide me with the specific plants that are now in violation." "You'll receive a formal notice within 3 business days," she said, making another note on her clipboard before walking away, true to her word. The notice arrived 2 days later, listing 5 plant species in my garden that were now supposedly in violation. The potential fine was $50 per plant per week, until removed. This time, instead of immediately appealing, I decided to investigate the rule change itself. The HOA covenant had clear procedures for amending the approved plant list, including a 30-day notice period for all residents and a public comment session. I spent that evening combing through the HOA website and email archives. There was indeed a notice about updated landscaping guidelines, but it had been posted just 1 week ago, not a month as Deborah had claimed. More importantly, it had been buried in the community updates section rather than sent as a direct communication as required by the covenant. I took screenshots of everything and started drafting an email to the entire HOA board, copying all residents, whose email addresses I had collected through the community Facebook group. "Dear board members," I wrote, "I'm writing regarding the recent update to the approved plant list and the subsequent violation notice I received. According to Section 12.4 of our covenant, amendments to landscaping guidelines require 30 days' notice to all residents via direct communication, followed by a comment period. The recent changes appear to have been implemented without following these procedures." I detailed the timeline, attached screenshots, and concluded, "I respectfully request that enforcement of the new guidelines be suspended until proper notification procedures have been followed. Additionally, I invite other residents who may have received similar notices to contact me so we can ensure the covenant is being applied fairly and transparently." I clicked send and waited for the fallout. It didn't take long. Within hours, my inbox was flooded with responses from neighbors sharing their own experiences with suddenly non-compliant plants. Patricia Levine also responded, her message terse and defensive. "Mr. Oswald, the board has reviewed your concerns and acknowledges that there may have been a procedural oversight in the notification process. All recent landscape violation notices will be rescinded pending proper notification and comment period. We appreciate your attention to our governance procedures." It was a small victory, but it felt significant. For perhaps the first time, Patricia had been forced to publicly acknowledge a mistake. The next day, I received an unexpected visitor. Gregory Thompson, one of the HOA board members, knocked on my door in the early evening. "Mr. Oswald, I hope I'm not interrupting," he said when I answered. Greg was in his 60s, a retired accountant who had always seemed reasonable during the few interactions we'd had. "Not at all," I said, surprised. "Would you like to come in?" He declined with a polite shake of his head. "I wanted to speak with you privately, away from the board. Your email yesterday raised some concerns that I've actually had for a while." "Oh," I gestured to the porch chairs. "Would you like to sit down?" We sat, and Greg lowered his voice. "Patricia and Deborah have been running the HOA like their personal fiefdom for the past 3 years. Several of us on the board have tried to moderate their approach, but we're often outvoted. This confirmed my suspicions." "I've heard from a lot of neighbors who feel targeted," I said. "It's worse than you know," Greg continued. "The fine revenue isn't all going back into the community as it should. I've noticed discrepancies in the financial reports, but whenever I ask questions, I'm shut down." I sat up straighter. "Are you suggesting there's financial impropriety?" Greg looked uncomfortable. "I'm not making any accusations. I'm just saying the books don't add up, and as a former accountant, that bothers me. Last year, we collected over $30,000 in fines, but only about $18,000 of that appears to have been reinvested in community improvements." "That's a significant discrepancy," I said, my mind racing. "Have you brought this up to the other board members?" "I've tried, but Patricia controls the agenda tightly. Any financial discussions are always rushed and superficial." He paused, looking around as if worried about being overheard. "There's an annual financial audit coming up next month. I think it might be time for a more thorough review than usual." "What can I do to help?" I asked. "Keep doing what you're doing," Greg said. "Holding them accountable to the covenant procedures. It creates a paper trail and forces transparency. And maybe—" He hesitated. "Maybe consider running for the board in the next election. We need more people who aren't afraid to ask questions." After Greg left, I sat on my porch for a long time, thinking about the implications of what he'd shared. If Patricia and Deborah were indeed mismanaging funds that went far beyond petty rule enforcement, it was potentially criminal. I decided to expand my research. The next day, I submitted a formal request to the HOA for financial records from the past 3 years. Under Oregon law and our own covenant, these records were supposed to be available to any homeowner upon request. The response came from Patricia herself, not the HOA secretary as would be customary. Dear Mr. Oswald, your request for comprehensive financial records will take time to process. We can provide these documents within 45 business days, as permitted by our covenant. There will be a copying fee of $0.25 per page. It was a delaying tactic, clearly designed to make the process as cumbersome and expensive as possible, but I wasn't deterred. I replied that I would be happy to receive the documents electronically to save paper and cost, and that I would await them within the 45-day time frame. In the meantime, I continued building alliances within the neighborhood. Felicity Walker became my strongest ally, introducing me to other homeowners who had tangled with Patricia and Deborah. We started meeting informally, first at my house and then rotating between homes, sharing stories and comparing notes. At one of these gatherings, a neighbor named Harold Bennett, who had lived in Rosewood Estates since its founding 15 years ago, shared something interesting. Before Patricia took over, the HOA was much more reasonable, he explained to the group of 8 homeowners gathered in my living room. The previous president, Robert Nichols, ran things democratically. Meetings were open, decisions were transparent, and fines were a last resort, not a first response. What changed? I asked. Patricia moved in and immediately started finding fault with everything. She claimed the previous board was too lenient, and that property values were suffering as a result. She campaigned on a platform of neighborhood integrity and won the presidency with just 17 votes in an election where most people didn't bother to participate. 17 votes. Felicity exclaimed. Out of how many households? We have 112 homes in Rosewood Estates, Harold said. Only about 30 people voted that year. Most people don't pay attention to HOA politics until there's a problem that affects them directly. This gave me an idea. So if we could get more people to participate in the next election, we could potentially change the leadership. Absolutely, Harold nodded. The annual meeting and board election is in 3 months. With enough support, we could definitely make changes. The group became energized by this possibility. We started formulating a plan to increase participation in the upcoming election, with each person taking responsibility for reaching out to specific sections of the neighborhood. But before we could implement this plan, things took an unexpected turn. 5 days after submitting my request for financial records, I received an email from Patricia that sent a chill down my spine. Mr. Oswald, during a routine inspection of the community, it has come to our attention that your home appears to be operating as a business location, based on the unusual frequency of visitors and meetings. Section 5.1 of our covenant explicitly prohibits commercial activities within residential properties. Please cease all business operations immediately or face fines of $200 per day. She was now targeting our community meetings, attempting to silence our organizing efforts by categorizing them as commercial activities. It was a blatant misuse of HOA authority to suppress dissent. I immediately forwarded the email to everyone in our group, along with my response to Patricia. Mrs. Levine, I am not operating a business from my home. I am exercising my right as a homeowner to host guests, as permitted in Section 8.2 of the Covenant, which explicitly states that normal social gatherings are allowed without restriction. Any attempt to characterize these gatherings otherwise could be considered harassment and an infringement on my rights as a homeowner. I copied the entire board, including Greg Thompson, on my response. Within an hour, Greg called me. "Brandon, things are escalating quickly," he said, sounding worried. "Patricia called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night. The only agenda item is Covenant Enforcement Actions, 1427 Pinecrest Drive. That's your address." "She's really determined to shut me down," I said. "It's more than that," Greg replied. "I think she's worried about the financial records request. There's something in those documents she doesn't want anyone to see. Can you help delay any enforcement actions until we can get those records?" Greg sighed. "I'll try, but I'm just one vote. Patricia usually has at least 2 other board members who vote with her consistently." The emergency meeting was closed to residents, but Greg called me immediately afterward with the results. "They voted 3-2 to issue you a formal cease and desist regarding commercial activities." I argued that there was no evidence of any business being conducted, but Patricia claimed she had reliable reports from neighbors. "That's absurd," I said. "We're just having conversations." "I know. But here's the concerning part: they also voted to hire a law firm to protect the HOA's interests in case you pursue legal action. They're authorizing up to $10,000 in legal fees, drawn from the reserve fund." This was a significant escalation. The HOA was now preparing to use our own community funds to fight against a legitimate inquiry into their financial practices. "Is that even allowed?" I asked. "Using reserve funds for legal action against a homeowner? It's a gray area," Greg admitted. "The reserve is supposed to be for major repairs and improvements, but the covenant does allow for necessary legal expenses. Patricia is stretching that definition, in my opinion." I thanked Greg for the information and immediately called a friend who worked as a real estate attorney. Though not specialized in HOA law, Deanna Peterson was able to offer some general advice. "They're overreaching," she told me after hearing the situation. "Social gatherings are not commercial activities, and they can't prove otherwise. More importantly, their attempt to block your access to financial records is highly suspicious. Oregon law is clear that HOA financial documents must be made available to members." "So what should I do?" I asked. "Document everything. Record all interactions if Oregon law allows it, which it does as long as you're a party to the conversation. Keep copies of all communications, and consider filing a complaint with the Oregon Real Estate Agency. They oversee HOAs and can investigate potential financial mismanagement." Following Diana's advice, I filed a formal complaint with the state agency the next day, detailing the pattern of selective enforcement, the suspicious financial discrepancies Greg had mentioned, and the attempts to block access to records. 2 days later, I received the cease and desist letter from the HOA's newly retained law firm, Bennett, Clark and Associates. It formally demanded that I cease all commercial activities and threatened legal action if I continued to operate a business from my residence. Rather than responding directly, I forwarded the letter to the state investigator handling my complaint, noting that it appeared to be an attempt to prevent homeowners from organizing. The situation had evolved far beyond a dispute about fence height. It was now about potential financial impropriety and abuse of power. I called another meeting of our neighborhood group, but this time we met at the local library to avoid giving Patricia any ammunition. 15 homeowners attended, our largest gathering yet. I updated everyone on the latest developments and shared the advice I'd received. "We need to accelerate our timeline," I told the group. "The annual meeting is still 2 months away, but Patricia is already trying to shut down our organizing efforts. We need to call for a special meeting of all homeowners to address these issues sooner." Harold raised his hand. According to the bylaws, we can force a special meeting if we get signatures from 25% of homeowners. That would be about 28 signatures. I think we can get that easily, Felicity said. People are starting to talk about all this. Patricia's heavy-handedness is backfiring. We drafted a petition that evening, calling for a special meeting to discuss financial transparency, enforcement procedures, and board accountability. Each person took responsibility for collecting signatures in different sections of the neighborhood. Within a week, we had 42 signatures, well above the required threshold. I formally submitted the petition to the HOA secretary, Marion Davies, who looked distinctly uncomfortable when I handed her the document. The bylaws require the board to schedule a special meeting within 30 days of receiving a valid petition. I reminded her gently. We'll expect notice of the date soon. Marion nodded nervously. I'll present this to President Levine today. The next morning, I woke to find a new violation notice taped to my front door. This time, I was being cited for improper storage of trash receptacles, with a potential fine of $50 per day. My trash cans were in the exact same location they had been for the past year, partially concealed by a small decorative screen as required by the covenant. It seemed Patricia was now grasping at straws, looking for any possible violation to discredit me. But her tactics were becoming increasingly transparent to the community. That afternoon, an official notice went out to all residents. A special meeting had been scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. The agenda listed the items from our petition, but with a notable addition: presentation on covenant enforcement procedures and community standards. Patricia was clearly planning to use the meeting as an opportunity to reassert her authority and justify her enforcement actions. We needed to be prepared. Our group met again at the library to strategize. We decided that rather than attacking Patricia directly, we would focus on specific procedural issues and the financial discrepancies. Greg Thompson agreed to present information about the budget inconsistencies he had observed, and several homeowners prepared to share their personal experiences with selective enforcement. The night of the special meeting arrived with tension hanging in the air like an approaching storm. The clubhouse was packed, with nearly 80 residents in attendance, a record turnout for a community meeting. Patricia sat at the front with the other board members, her expression stern. "Welcome to this special meeting of the Rosewood Estates Homeowners Association," she began at exactly 7 p.m. "As you know, this meeting was called by petition. Before we address those concerns, the board would like to present an overview of our enforcement procedures and the importance of community standards." She launched into a 20-minute presentation about property values, community aesthetics, and the board's duty to enforce the covenant consistently. It was clearly aimed at justifying her approach and painting those who questioned her as threats to the neighborhood's quality. When she finished, I raised my hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Levine. Now I believe we should move to the items listed in the petition, beginning with financial transparency." Patricia's smile tightened. "We'll get to those items, Mr. Oswald, but first, the board has prepared responses to several misconceptions that appear to be circulating." "Point of order," called Harold Bennett from the back of the room. "According to Robert's rules, which our bylaws specify as our parliamentary procedure, the agenda items requested in the petition must be addressed before new business." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Patricia looked momentarily flustered, then nodded. "Very well. The first item is financial transparency. Our treasurer, James Wilson, will present an overview of our financial position." "James, A thin man with glasses who typically said little at meetings gave a brief and general summary of the HOA's finances, emphasizing that the association was solvent and well managed. He made no mention of the specific concerns about fine revenue or discrepancies in the accounts. When he finished, Greg Thompson raised his hand. As a board member and former accountant, I'd like to add some context to that report. He walked to the front of the room. Over the past 3 years, our fine revenue has increased from approximately $7,000 annually to over $30,000 last year. However, our community improvement spending has not increased proportionally. He displayed a simple chart showing the growing gap between fine revenue and community investments. Additionally, there are several expense categories labeled as administrative costs that have grown substantially without clear explanation. Patricia interrupted. Those administrative costs include necessary legal expenses and compliance management. Perhaps, Greg continued calmly, but the lack of detailed reporting makes it impossible for homeowners to understand exactly how their money is being spent. I propose that we commission an independent audit of our finances for the past 3 years. The suggestion was met with applause from many residents. Patricia looked around the room, clearly gauging the level of support for the idea. That would be an unnecessary expense, she objected. Our books are regularly reviewed by our accounting firm. Which is owned by your brother-in-law, someone called out from the crowd. Patricia's face flushed. That's irrelevant. Wilson Accounting is a respected firm. I move that we vote on commissioning an independent audit, Greg said formally. I second the motion, I added quickly. Patricia looked to the HOA's attorney, who had been sitting quietly at the side of the room. He nodded reluctantly, and she turned back to the assembly. Very well. All in favor of commissioning an independent audit of the HOA finances for the past 3 years, please raise your hand. The response was overwhelming. Nearly every hand in the room went up. Patricia's jaw tightened as she acknowledged the result. The motion passes. We will seek proposals from independent auditing firms. We moved on to the next item, enforcement procedures. Several homeowners shared their experiences with what they perceived as selective or arbitrary enforcement. Felicity described having to repaint her house, and an elderly resident tearfully explained how she had been fined for a rose bush that extended 6 inches over the sidewalk. As the stories accumulated, the mood in the room shifted palpably. What had been individual frustrations were now revealed as part of a pattern. Patricia and Deborah's enforcement tactics weren't just strict, they appeared to be deliberately intimidating and possibly targeted at certain residents. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my comments focused on procedure rather than personalities. The covenant is clear that enforcement must be consistent, transparent, and fair. What we've heard tonight suggests that hasn't always been the case. I propose that the board develop written enforcement guidelines that clarify how violations are identified, measured, and addressed. This proposal also passed by a large margin, despite Patricia's objection that it would tie the hands of the compliance committee. The final agenda item was board accountability. Harold Bennett took the lead on this topic, proposing several changes to increase transparency, including recording board meetings, publishing detailed minutes, and requiring board members to disclose any potential conflicts of interest. By the end of the 3-hour meeting, the community had voted for significant changes to how the HOA operated. Patricia maintained a rigid smile throughout, but her displeasure was evident in her clipped responses and tense posture. As people filed out of the clubhouse, there was a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time in years, the homeowners had collectively asserted themselves against what many viewed as an overbearing board. The next few weeks brought significant developments. First, the board announced that they had engaged Marshall and Associates, a respected local accounting firm, to conduct the independent audit. Second, all pending violation notices, including my alleged trash can and commercial activity violations, were temporarily suspended while the board developed the new enforcement guidelines. But the most startling development came from an unexpected quarter. The state investigator who had been looking into my complaint contacted me to schedule an interview. When we met at a local coffee shop, she revealed that my complaint had triggered a broader investigation. "We've received similar complaints about Rosewood Estates over the past year," explained investigator Sarah Martinez. "Your detailed documentation helped connect some dots. We've subpoenaed the HOA's bank records, and there appear to be some concerning transactions." "What kind of transactions?" I asked. "I can't share specifics yet, but there are regular payments to a landscaping company called Premier Grounds that doesn't appear to actually perform services in your community. We're looking into who owns that company." The implications were clear. Someone might be using a shell company to siphon HOA funds. Given what Greg had shared about the missing fine revenue, I had a strong suspicion about who might be involved. A week later, my suspicions were confirmed in dramatic fashion. I was working from home when I heard a commotion outside. Looking out my window, I saw 2 police cars parked in front of Patricia Levine's house. As I watched, officers escorted Patricia and Deborah Carson to separate vehicles. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Felicity. "Are you seeing this?" she asked breathlessly. "They're arresting Patricia and Deborah." "I'm watching it right now," I said, stunned despite my suspicions. "Do you know what's happening?" "Harold just called me. He said the audit uncovered evidence of embezzlement." Apparently, Patricia and Deborah set up a fake landscaping company and have been paying themselves HOA funds for non-existent services for years. Later that day, the remaining board members sent an emergency communication to all residents confirming that Patricia and Deborah had been arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. According to the preliminary findings of the audit, they had diverted over $120,000 of HOA funds over the past 3 years. The news spread quickly throughout Portland, even making the local television news. "HOA officers arrested for embezzlement." Read the headline on the evening broadcast, accompanied by footage of Patricia being placed in a police car. In the aftermath, the HOA vice president, Michael Chen, assumed the role of acting president and called for an emergency election to fill the vacant board positions. The community rallied, with a record turnout for the special election. Greg Thompson was elected president, and to my surprise, I was elected to the board as well, along with Felicity and 2 other neighbors who had been active in our reform efforts. Our first action as a new board was to commission a complete review of all HOA policies and procedures. We hired a respected HOA management company to handle day-to-day operations, replacing the informal system that had allowed Patricia and Deborah to operate with little oversight. We also reviewed all violation notices and fines issued over the past year, refunding those that were found to be arbitrary or based on flawed measurements, including several fence height violations similar to mine. As for Patricia and Deborah, they eventually accepted plea deals to avoid trial. Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in prison for embezzlement and fraud, while Deborah received probation and community service in exchange for testifying against her cousin. The audit ultimately revealed that they had been targeting certain homeowners with excessive violations, then using the fine revenue to fund their fake landscaping company. They had also manipulated measurements and rules interpretations to generate violations where none existed. In a final ironic twist, after Patricia's house was sold to cover restitution to the HOA, the new owners installed a fence that was genuinely 7 feet tall, but because it was entirely on their property and set back from the boundary, the new guidelines our board had implemented allowed it without issue. 6 months after that first violation notice about my fence, Rosewood Estates had transformed. Board meetings were now well-attended, transparent affairs. The combative atmosphere had been replaced by genuine community engagement. We had revised the covenant to clarify vague provisions and established clear, fair enforcement procedures. As for my fence, it stood exactly as it always had, 6 feet tall and well within my property line. But it represented something more now. A reminder that sometimes standing your ground can lead to positive change far beyond your own backyard. Looking back, I realized that what began as a dispute over a few inches of cedar became the catalyst for exposing corruption and rebuilding a community. The professional survey that showed the fence was on my property didn't just win my personal battle. It started a chain reaction that ultimately restored democracy to our neighborhood. That fall, we held a community barbecue in the park at the center of Rosewood Estates. As I looked around at neighbors chatting amicably, children playing, and board members serving food instead of serving violation notices, I couldn't help but feel proud of what we'd accomplished together. Felicity joined me, handing me a cold drink. "Not bad for a guy who just wanted to keep his fence," she said with a smile. "I never expected any of this," I admitted. "I just knew something wasn't right about that measurement." "Sometimes the smallest discrepancies reveal the biggest problems," she said. "And sometimes the tallest fences make the best neighbors, especially when they're exactly 6 feet tall and completely on your property." We laughed, raising our glasses in a toast to boundaries, both the physical ones that define our properties and the ethical ones that define our communities. In Rosewood Estates, both were now being properly measured and respected.